Thanks so much, Cypher, for agreeing to be interviewed. I really appreciate you taking the time. Could you start by introducing yourself and your channel?
Well, I'm Dr. Joe Hall Patton, or Cypher on the channel. I've been using a pseudonym for the last decade and don't see a reason to stop. Um, the channel is called The Cynical Historian. I focus mainly on analytical history and try to be a bit topical as well so that I can apply history to the present. I also run various other social media stuff, Discord and Twitch and Twitter and all that. Not gonna call it X.
I'll put
Um,
your socials in the video description for anyone who wants to contact you that way or get in touch with your community. One thing you touched on there, which I really like about your channel, is that it unashamedly connects the present with the past and
mhm.
uses history as a lens to understand our present and unashamedly gets what people would call political with
Oh yeah.
history. I really
Oh,
like that about your channel because so many people have this idea that history needs to be non-political. And I get political with my channel for
mhm.
exactly the same reason. And yeah, you can't separate the political from the historical because the one is a product of the other.
Yeah, I always find it funny how often I'll get people complaining that I've become too political, and it's like,
Oh, right.
go back
How long have you been
and watch
watching
my
me?
third episode ever. Actually,
Right,
you could
right.
argue the first episode where I go and break down the number of Oscar winners, Best Picture Oscar winners by how many of them are historical, and that has an implication for how the Oscars are run. Like that's
Right.
my
Yeah, very
first
much so.
episode. Like that's
Right.
political.
Yeah.
The third episode was about the Boston bombing that had just happened, Like
Yeah,
I've
right.
I've been political the whole freaking time, and you can't not be. To be
Yeah.
apolitical is to have still decided to just support the status quo.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that's all that means.
Yeah.
And the status quo is itself political.
Yeah.
Basically, if
A
they
political construct. Yeah.
claim to be apolitical, then they're freaking conservative. That's what they are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Actually, it reminds me a lot of Artun Shea because people say that about him too. Oh, you're getting all lefty, which is, a bit ridiculous. But you look at his video, like his 7 years ago, I think it was 7 years ago, his Braveheart video, right? And
I don't think
yeah,
I've ever
he
seen that
goes,
one.
no, I mean, I think it's about 7 years ago, a very old one in his channel. But he gets into the issue of obviously the political tensions between and the historical tensions between Scotland and England, and then how do you represent this, and then how do you represent it on, and he explains how, yeah, Blade Runner's famously been called one of the least historical movies, and he goes on to say, here's why I think yes, it's got all these errors, but in some ways I think that doesn't matter because there's a bigger narrative being made here, and that narrative has to be told in a certain way to have an impact on the audience, and you need to impact the modern audience. So yeah, he's had that all along as well, I think. And as a
Mhm.
filmmaker, he's particularly sensitive to it. And if you've seen his latest film, which I'm sure you have, that yeah,
Mhm.
that's very politically loaded, and rightly
Yeah,
so.
I went to the third showing of it.
Oh wow, you saw it in person.
Oh yeah. Well, I
Fantastic.
almost feel like you put the third showing in Albuquerque just so I would be
I
there.
see. That's sensational. Can you describe your research method and what quality control measures you take for your videos? And I know you discussed this recently in a live stream with Emperor Tiger Star when you touched on the importance of citations for history YouTube, and you made a number of comments there which I particularly liked, which I've talked to you about.
Well, I'm always harping on the need for proper citation and putting a bibliography in your description and everything. I mean, I've been saying that for a decade now, but that's really derived from the fact that I come at this from a historical background. I started my channel in 2013 already holding a bachelor's in history. Um, and I've continued to seek more education now that I have a PhD. Got finished that last year. Um, and of course, that affects the way that I do scholarship on my channel as well. I've never viewed my channel as being anywhere close to as rigorous as that. I'm not trying
Sure. Yeah.
yeah, I'm not trying to make it into a publishing platform for new scholarship, even though every once in a
Yeah,
while I'll
all the historical channels I've interviewed so far have said, look, I try and follow academic historiography that I've learned. Some of them because they have a history degree or they've done a history unit in their course. But I wouldn't say you can cite my channel as a source. I wouldn't pretend to be an academic source. I wouldn't say you could even cite my channel as the source in a high school essay. And I would say the same about my channel. I aspire to the academic historical method or historiographical method, but yeah, don't cite me as a source. Hey, look at my references and go cite the references, read them and cite them instead. Right.
it
So I
greatly
know what you
depends
mean
on the
there.
video. Um,
Yeah. In your
because
case, though,
I
you've
do
got
publish
videos
original
which are
scholarship.
probably, yeah, exactly. And I was going to say some
Uh,
of your videos are probably just recycled lecture notes, right? Because you lecture.
yeah, well, I literally have videos that are just lectures, and
Yeah, right,
that
right,
like I set them up specifically like, oh, it's a snow day, and
right,
so I'm gonna
right.
record it instead
Yeah, yeah, there you
and do
go.
all the
Yeah.
editing and everything. I've done that a couple of times. COVID made me go
Oh, of
online as
course. Right. Yeah.
well. Didn't realize that people would like the lectures, and then I put
Mm,
those out, and suddenly people liked them. And it's like, oh, okay, you just like lecture,
right,
but besides that, it's not just recycled lecture notes. A lot of the time, it's literally original scholarship. It's like the one that I just did on mass shootings. Like that's straight from my dissertation. I'm just reading
yeah,
my
exactly.
dissertation.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, that's
Um,
why I really loved it, actually.
but I wouldn't like make original scholarship for YouTube specifically.
Right,
That's,
right,
like I have a number of presentations I've done at academic conferences that I've turned into videos and that. Like
right,
I have
right.
another one coming up about applying history to the present on YouTube. Like
Yep, yep.
that's actually a conference paper that I've turned into a video. I've done
Right.
that a number of times too. So like there are
Yeah.
degrees of like how much scholarship is being put into these things. Like if I'm doing a lot of
Mm,
primary source research, then yeah, of course that's like something much more heavy on the academic side. But normally I'm basically just synthesizing a whole bunch of books and
right.
turning it into a video. Like
Yeah.
that is completely secondary and synthetic, which means that I am not even a secondary source at that point. I'm a tertiary
Right.
source, no
Tertiary.
better than
Yeah.
like a encyclopedia
Encyclopedia.
article
Mm.
or it used to be really common that a lot of historians had like weekly columns in the local
Oh, okay.
newspaper or something like that, and
Right.
it's not really any different from that.
Mm. Yeah, that's really interesting. You should, I mean, obviously, since you are a working academic, it's really interesting to hear you say that you've produced some academic material like for conference papers or lectures or journals and then turn those into videos. I've actually had the opposite experience. Three of my videos I've turned into conference papers, and one of
Oh,
them
yeah.
I actually ended up getting published in a scholarly journal. So, yeah,
Hmm.
starting with my scripts and then thinking, this is the thing. I've done so much research. Why don't I just try and knock it up and get it published? Yeah. So that's been really cool for me.
There have been videos that I've done primary source research just basically because the literature isn't really there.
Right.
Like I
Right.
remember when I did it's about P.T. Barnum.
Oh, I know the one. The world's greatest showman. Is that it? Is it
Yeah,
world's
that's right.
greatest showman?
Yeah.
Right.
Uh, I think we have a bit of a delay, by the way. Um,
Oh, right. Yeah.
I mean, we're half a world away from each other. But there just wasn't a lot of great scholarship on like the people involved with his circus, the
Right. I
his
see.
his exhibits. Because for the most part he ran a museum, not a circus. That's what the movie is about. So a huge point of contention was that like, oh well, he's exploiting these people and how dare they praise him
Mm,
for this? And it's like,
right. Right.
well, why hasn't anybody just gone and looked what the people themselves said? Like,
Mm,
if you're gonna be angry on them feeling exploited, you better find some primary source evidence of that.
right.
Turns out
Right.
like vast majority of them were singing his praises, you know?
Mm. Right.
Even when well outside, like the famous bearded lady, for instance,
Yes.
she only worked with him for 3 years. Came out with a book about her life in general. Um, and during that part of her life that she spent with him, which means that he didn't really have any influence on her after that, like she did not have to sing his praises, and yet she did. Like,
Yeah.
and
Right.
if
Right.
you're gonna act all aggrieved about this, you better find something proving the aggrievement.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so I had to do a lot of primary source work on that. But that's like when, the scholarship just isn't there yet.
Yeah, it's really interesting you should say that actually, because it touches on something that I was fortunate enough to be taught when I did my first year unit of history in college, which was nationalism, imperialism, and revolution. And we did New Zealand or Aotearoa, and we did India
What's that
and
last one? Aotearoa.
Aotearoa, New Zealand. Aotearoa is the Maori name for New Zealand, the Aboriginal
Oh,
name. Yeah.
okay.
I try and remember to say the Aboriginal name out of respect because in New Zealand, the Aboriginal people use it. And so yeah, in India, Canada, South Africa, Kenya, and Ireland, we did Ireland. One point that I found really interesting was because this was at the point where, so this was early 90s when I did my bachelor degree, my Bachelor of Classics, Bachelor of Arts in Classics and European History. And this was a time when social history had already been introduced in the 60s and had now, well, this was in Tasmania, a very tiny little college in Tasmania, but by this stage in the early 90s, by the late 80s, concepts like social history and post-colonialism or post-colonial analysis had entered the academic world as well. So one thing that which I learned, which I was really grateful about, was actually this concept of agency and agency of people who are being spoken about by sources. And then, as you said, the question of, well, when somebody is spoken about, that's different to them speaking for themselves. So I found that when I was encountering some of my friends later on after college, particularly during my working life, and they had the typically what would call for want of a better word, a typical or centrist or soft liberal view, they would say, oh, these people and this stuff happened to them and it was all very bad. And very much like what you're saying. And then I would say, like, yeah, but have you considered like that some of these people might have had a different view of that, or that some of these people might have actually been involved in that, and they're like, that no, that sounds weird, dude. Come on, no,
Yeah.
doesn't make any
Well,
sense. But this
that's like
whole
a perfect example of that would be the fact that like every single Indian war in American history
mm,
involved tribes siding with the United States.
right,
And
yeah,
that gets completely lost. Like when
yeah,
for instance, during the Geronimo outbreak in 1882 through 86, there were more Apaches fighting against Geronimo than there were the Apaches fighting with
right,
Geronimo. Like
mm,
that, pure and simple. There were more Apaches against Geronimo, and and the other folks. Geronimo actually isn't a war chief, by the way. He's basically a medicine man.
all right,
But he was kind of like the spiritual leader.
right, okay,
But the fact that when you bring up that fact, will often
yeah,
try to either backpedal and be like, oh well, that's an exception. It's like, no, it's not. Uh,
mm,
and or they'll try to be like, play sides of like, well, the Apache scouts, they were the bad guys, and it's like,
yeah,
no,
right, right,
hold on. They have
yeah.
their
I
own
found that a
agency. Like
lot.
they get to
Yeah.
choose what they want?
Exactly. I found that a lot when I was studying South Africa and Kenya. And obviously this bled into the more general African history. And then I'm saying to my friends, you know what a protectorate was, right? You know what a protectorate was? Like African states literally asking the British Empire, could you please protect us?
Mhm.
Because we want to stop getting raided by like that kingdom next door, which keeps on raiding us. So can we have an agreement where you guys actually protect us, and then they're not going to come raiding us anymore? And of course the British Empire is like, oh well, I mean, yeah, hadn't thought about it, but yeah, now you say, oh sure.
Yeah.
So sometimes you find out that, well, in places like
Divide and
Uganda, for
conquer.
example, yeah, you
Uh,
get the British Empire almost backing into territory
Yeah.
by accident.
There's
Oh sorry, oops,
I
accidentally
had a
made
I
you
had a
part of the
friend
empire.
who was studying the British Empire going into Sudan. And
Mm,
She always said that it was a an empire by stumbling.
Oh, right, right,
Because they just
right.
kind of stumbled everywhere. And
Yeah,
like you look at their actual like land fighting ability, it's dismal. Like like
right.
they're losing like every single fight and yet
Yeah,
still somehow winning. Um,
yeah.
it's
I mean,
insane.
Sudan's absolutely, Sudan's absolutely famous. I
Yeah.
mean, Khartoum and the rest of it. Yeah,
Yeah.
literally stuff of legend. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it was interesting
Shout
actually
out to
because what
Crystal Knight and Smith for that.
what
Um,
what prepared me for that actually was my classical history because I learned how Rome took over Greece, which was not the way that I'd always imagined, where Rome just it was a big empire and it was just gobbling up all these states. But it started off as these anti-piracy raids, and then they were raiding the pirates, and then they were trying to stop the pirates, and then of course then they make landfall and kind of beat up the place where the pirates were coming from. And it's like that'll stop you coming back for a while, and then they'd move back, and then they'd be like, well, we might as well have a little base here because, I mean, if
yeah.
we're going to be coming out here, we might as well.
That-
And then of course, then some local lord or king or whatever says, oh, I can help you guys out, and then yeah,
yeah.
gradually they kind of get sucked
More
in,
and
as it
more
were, and then
ensconced.
yeah, it's
Um,
kind of then it's
it's
I'm
also a like it's a key thing that a lot of these anti-imperialist folks, especially like the online anti-imperialist folks, like they're letting their
yes.
anti-imperialism get in the way of their anti-imperialism.
Oh,
Like
I totally agree. Yeah,
where it's like, there's only one side that's good and one side that's bad, and it's like get beyond good and evil. Like
yeah,
we should have been moving away from that in
right.
terms of historical interpretation decades ago. Like if you're still playing that game, you're half a century behind the
Yeah,
times.
yeah.
Get good. But also they don't realize that there's like an overarching strategy to playing that game of
Mm,
playing sides off against each other. It's called divide
yeah,
and conquer.
yeah. Of
Um
course. Yeah.
and like for some reason they've forgotten the divide part.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. And when I talk about it, this is why I tend to speak about it with two people in terms of agency, because I find that agency is an accessible concept. So I say, well, look, agency humanizes people in the past. And what I'm afraid you're doing is you're actually removing agency of these people. For example, I'm sorry, but there were some Aboriginal treaties which were signed and people knew what they were doing. They weren't simple
Yeah.
natives scribbling an incomprehensible mark on a document they didn't understand. There is evidence for a couple of treaties in Aboriginal Australian history, for example, of men who absolutely did know what they were doing when
Hmm.
they made these treaties. And
Hmm.
of course they did, because that's why they made them in the first place. And yeah, sure. I mean, the settlers broke them as usual, as you'd expect. But it's not a question of, oh, poor simple native guy got tricked by the white man. And it was nowhere near as simple as, oh, just jangle some beads in
I
front of them and they just
I
signed
don't think
everything.
that's a common thing. I don't really run into that interpretation very often. But maybe
Mm.
that's because
In British, I
our
mean, it's in Australian history is very different because you're dealing with a nation which is in the Industrial Revolution. So a lot of people just have these massive
hmm,
assumptions about what the Australian
in
Aboriginal
there
people thought,
there are
and they
certainly nomadic tribes in the that the US dealt with, especially here in the Southwest. Apaches for the most part, while they did have some agricultural practices, they like for instance, the Mescaleros are named Mescaleros because they basically farmed agave
oh
plants.
yeah, I know
Yeah.
what the plant you mean. Yeah, yeah, agave. Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
that they're named after that. And like Navajos, for instance, they were semi-sedentary. And then of course there's the Puebloans who were just even the Spanish called them Indios forgetting the word for civilized, but they called them civilized Indians.
Right.
The in California, you had groups that were using slash and burn agriculture on a regular
Mm.
basis. Like there's no such thing as a pristine wilderness in California.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and
Um,
slash and burn was used extensively in Australia, and the Aboriginal people left their mark on the land.
yeah, but that's agriculture. Um,
Yeah.
so I mean, there are groups like Paiutes, for instance, who like didn't really live in a place that was conducive to agriculture.
Mm.
And so, they lived a lot on pinyon and pine nuts and fish. Um, the squeaking out a very meager existence that got much harsher as trails ran through and Utes started slave raiding and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, right.
So like every tribe has its own history, and like
Yeah.
what's interesting is all the treaties with these tribes are fully accessible digitally for
Oh,
the
right, right. Yep.
US, and you can go and just read them. Like there's a lot of ones
Yeah.
where it's like, oh, well, this actually seems very reasonable. And like there's a
Right,
reason
right.
why the big push to get tribes onto reservations here in the Southwest was during the 1870s and the Grant administration with the whole peace policy. And that's where you see the majority of those treaties being put through. And like, for instance, the 1868 treaty with Navajos is like one of the most lenient and forgiving treaties on record, partially
Right.
because they'd been so nastily treated at Bosque Redondo.
Right.
But the point is that you can't have these like overly broad interpretations and really be able to deal with history as it is.
History. Yeah, yeah. See, in Australia, there's been a lot of romanticization of the Aboriginal people, which actually the Aboriginal people themselves have had to try and get
Oh yeah,
out of,
there's a
and
ton of that
and a
here.
lot of the noble savage stuff. And you get people saying, "Oh, these people didn't understand what territory meant. They didn't have any concept of owning the land." And you find out, yeah, they did, because they had other guys over there, and they knew this is our area and this is their area, and if we go to
Mhm.
there, there's going to be trouble, right?
Yeah,
So yeah, they're not childish simpletons or anything like that. I think it's so demeaning when that agency is removed, and that's why I try and
yeah.
emphasize that concept of agency to
But
let
there
people know.
is
Actually,
there
yeah,
is a
sorry, go
point
ahead.
where agency goes too far, where
Sure.
fact is people are stupid. Like,
Right. Yeah.
when we're talking about, like, for instance, the British Empire just kind of stumbling into empire, um,
Mm,
the a lot of that has to do with stupidity. Like they
mm,
didn't really know what they were doing, and
yeah.
like I think a lot of the time people put far too much agency on people who are just stumbling through life, who are trying to figure out what they're doing.
Oh,
It's
right. Right. Yeah. Yes.
far
Yeah.
too often that. Now, I don't
Trying to make
want
some
to.
grand conspiracy or big plan when actually they were just reacting in the moment, you mean?
Yeah, yeah, and it's
Yeah.
not to say that, like, indigenous people here were fooled, tricked
Yeah.
into unequal treaties, but like at the same time, they're looking at it in the moment. They're not
Yeah.
thinking like,
Exactly. Right.
if I sign away my ability to hunt on these lands and for this reservation, will I lose even the ability to trade off reservation or something along those
Yeah. Of
lines?
course. Yeah. Right.
These are things that you're just not thinking about in the moment. And so it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, ignorant, we're all ignorant. We're all in
Mm.
our own little, our
We all
own
have
little,
blinkers.
yeah. And a historian should be able to take that into account as well.
Yeah.
My first scholarly work was literally called A Study in Confusion, and it
Oh,
was
wow.
about
Right.
it was about the British decision to intervene into the Russian Civil War. I concurred with most historians on this, although there's been a fringe group of ones who are like, it was purely to defeat the commies, and it's like,
Oh,
no,
yeah.
no, come on, especially when we aligned with commies.
Yeah. Right.
Can't defeat them when you align with them. But
Yeah.
the British cabinet meetings, which I actually had to FOIA open, was very clear. They didn't know what the hell they were doing, and
Mm.
that's actually been the kind of the consensus, is that like the Allies just generally didn't know why they were there. Um, like there's a whole bunch of competing reasons and none of them make sense.
Yeah. Right.
And like, yeah, they just kind of fell into it, and
Yeah.
that's why I called it a study in confusion. And that's been a driving part of the way I view history as well, is that, agency isn't everything. You need to be
Yep,
able
yep.
to understand
Mm.
where people are acting stupid.
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, definitely there are constraints on agency in any given situation. Sometimes those constraints are simple knowledge constraints, or people just being unaware of something, or only seeing something from a narrow perspective, as you say. I'm glad you raised that because that FOI request that you cited gives me a more of an insight into your research methodology and what you do to ensure accuracy and validity. So, I guess as an academic yourself and as a lecturer, you have quite an organic, or what would be for you a very organic process of research, accumulating information about topics and laterally running it through an established method, maybe even the way that you write your lectures, and you already have an awareness of where do I start? Should I start with the primary sources here? Should I on this topic, or maybe in this topic I start with the secondary sources? You already have an idea about which end you should start at. For example, in the case where, as you said, the secondary sources were just really light on, and it just didn't have much. You thought, okay, I'm just going to have to do the legwork myself.
Hmm.
For the sake of people who don't have that academic background, just briefly, how do you differentiate between high and low quality secondary sources?
Well, it's more, one, in terms of quality, it's, the argument being made, the site, their evidence,
Mm,
how the way you evaluate any argument. And all secondary sources are going to be making an argument. They have some sort of
yep.
thesis, whether implied or explicit. Um, how they make that argument, the method,
The
the
methodology, yeah.
evidence, all of
Mm,
that is how you're going to evaluate it for quality. But in the case of trying to find works on particular, like the with the Greatest Showman thing, for particular of his oddities, as he called them, um,
yes.
of like, how did they feel about all of
Understand
this?
themselves,
Like,
yeah.
yeah,
Right.
there just hasn't been any work in terms of like trying to put that into perspective.
Right.
And understandably so, it's a very niche topic. Like P.T. Barnum in and of himself is not going to be a particular research interest for most historians.
Right. Yeah, very
Um,
niche.
yeah, and so like going even further and like studying, any of his particular oddities is going to make it even more difficult to research, even though a lot of them wrote their own memoirs and everything. But like
Mm,
oftentimes that's where the scholarship stops is with their particular memoir, and there's no
right.
biography or secondary source that talks about them. That's just a hole in the
Mm,
scholarship. You can always
yep.
find that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sometimes you'll find stuff where it's like there's a, newspaper article from 100 years later that is talking about that kind of stuff or something along those lines. A perfect example would be I one of the topics that I go into a lot is the Southern Nevada, what were called Indian renegades.
Mm,
Or Pite renegades would probably be a better term. A series of serial killers and spree killers
wow.
in Southern Nevada, um, starting in the 1880s, going all the way until 1919.
Mm,
It's the last case in my case study in my book, and one of them, of particular interest to everyone, is Kehoe. Not to be confused with the Bath Massacre guy. Uh, Spelled differently too.
right. Right. Okay.
It's referring to his name is referring to the Spanish word for grumbler,
Mm.
because he had a lame leg that,
Oh, I see.
yeah. Um, so I can only confirm that he killed 5 people.
Mm,
But the number is often exaggerated to 25.
wow.
But there's a couple of other possibilities that it might get that number up to like 7 or 8.
Mm,
But in either case, he disappeared in the desert. Then he was found desiccated. His corpse was found desiccated by the desert. He clearly lived into the 1930s, and was
mm,
found in 1940, and basically mummified by the desert, right? So
right.
he went on this whole, journey through the Las Vegas Valley as like an attraction for a while.
Oh,
Um,
right. I
and
see. Yeah.
and then like, he had various storage places until finally being buried in 1978 in Cathedral Canyon. Um,
Mm,
that which is just west of Las Vegas. Um, and the like every bit of that story is just fantastic.
mhm.
There's so
Yeah.
much crazy stuff going on there. Um, and like it connects it back to this larger history of violence in the area, and then how like Las Vegas itself developed. And like the and it touches every little bit of Las Vegas history up until his burial in 78. There have been a lot of newspaper articles about it. My father, who is also a historian, has done a lot of work
Mm,
on it, but never published anything. The local chapter of what's called Eclampus Vitus, which you could call a drinking historical society or a historical drinking society. I am a
Right.
member. The it's called each chapter has its own, joke name and number. So it's chapter 1919, which is the last posse to go after Kehoe, and it's called Kehoe Posse. Uh,
Mm, yeah. Makes
like
sense.
so there's a ton of like local thought about it, but there is absolutely no scholarship on the guy, which is insane. Like, I mean, my dad, I guess, could be said to be doing scholarship on him, but he didn't publish anything. So it's like, it
Right.
just, so I'm like the first publication about this guy, and so that's a massive hole in the scholarship, even
Mm,
though there's so much there, so much evidence to use, so much to piece together, and
yeah.
such a really fascinating story to tell.
Yeah, I think that happens when you find a little thread, a historical thread, and you pull on it. You get intrigued by the narrative, and you just get sucked into that research. I've had that happen to me a couple of times, and you get down that rabbit hole. And actually, a couple of the video scripts that I wrote, which ended up turning into conference papers, started like that, just because I had a quite a little passion for something which looked quite small at the start, but ended up getting quite larger. Well, thank you so much for giving me so much of your time today. I've really appreciated it. And as you know, I've learned a lot myself, as I have from all of the other people I've interviewed as well. It's been really great to see quite a consistent range of answers on this question, although expressed sometimes in different ways and from different perspectives. And just about every time I've interviewed someone, they've made a comment about something that I hadn't thought about or given me an insight into their particular area of research that I wasn't aware of before. So, yeah, as yourself, a professional historian and somebody who actually has a very high standard of research, I'd like to again thank you for making this contribution to my little project. And
Oh, thanks for
I'm
having me.
fully behind, as you know, I'm fully behind your own desire to raise the bar in history YouTube. And I think that if we can actually encourage our viewers to expect a strong standard from ourselves, and yeah, maybe they will take that to other channels they view and start asking, oh, yeah, but how did you know that? Or at least, where did you get that from? If they get them to say, where did you get that from? Or where are you getting your sources from? Or what are your sources? I think that would be really good and can only benefit the overall strength of the genre on YouTube as it is. And one thing I'm very concerned about is the strength of the genre. I want our genre to be taken seriously.
Hmm. Yeah, it was interesting at NCPH at the National Council on Public History this time around. With M Laser History and
Mm.
Mr. Beat, and
Oh yeah, yeah, great guy.
it was kind of clear that the actual programming administrators were trying to kind of shove us in a corner. They put us
Oh really?
downstairs
Mm.
outside of the main conference hall and off in a corner where there was only one other paper done in that room the entire
Wow.
or even in that section the entire conference. So they were
Mm.
very obviously trying to like diminish us. There was a bunch of
Yeah,
problems when
yeah.
we were starting because um this time I wanted to chair it. Last time I had a friend who happened to tick the box of being a gay woman,
Okay.
and
Yeah,
so wouldn't get dinged on that. But I wanted to chair it this time. It
yeah.
like I'm got my PhD. Now
Yeah, it was your
now
time.
I can do it,
Yep.
But the
Yeah.
problem was like we're all white guys.
Yeah.
So they tried to ding us on that and be like, well, we can't accept it until you bring in some sort of diversity. It's like, Mantus is freaking
Mm.
Slovakian. Like
Yeah, right, right. It's got to count for
it,
something.
like, and Matt is not a professional historian. Like he's got
Mm.
his master's in journalism,
Oh,
and
okay.
yet he's one of the
Yeah.
he hadn't hit a million yet, but he just hit a million
Wow.
subscribers. Um,
Sensational.
and I think he was at like 900,000 when we went to Salt Lake City
Hmm.
for that. But despite them trying to shove us off in a corner for that size of room, we had the highest attendance.
Oh, wow. Really? That's
So,
fantastic. Yeah.
so that
That
was,
says a lot.
yeah. So it like despite them trying to shove us in a corner and kind of,
Marginalize
marginalize
the,
us,
yeah.
yeah. They we had the highest attended of the small lecture halls. There was the big ballroom ones that got more attendance because there's just more space. But for that size of room, we had the most attended. We had people like spilling out in the hallway
Wow. Fantastic.
and like a bunch of people sitting on the floor and that
Mm.
like it was just a ton of people. Like they really should
Mm.
have given us a larger lecture hall and not shoved us downstairs.
In the basement.
Um,
Yeah.
but it shows that there is a growing recognition of the value of HistoryTube as a history communications
Mm.
platform, and like that it's kind of becoming the default way that a lot of the public get their understanding of
Right.
history. And
Yep.
so
Absolutely.
that that puts the imperative on raising the bar
Mm.
for HistoryTube
Yep.
uh, be that much more important.
Mm. Yeah. That's very useful insight and fantastic to hear that people are actually taking notice of this and talking about where do we go from here and how do we encourage this? That's one of the reasons why, of course, I put that question in there. But then I had no idea that this was actually gaining some kind of traction at a broader or higher level. This is really
Hmm.
good to hear. Is
At
there any
the
way
academic
of getting
level.
those? Yeah, exactly. Is there any way of getting those conference papers or presentations? Are they
Well,
online somewhere? Or
as I said,
oh no, you're going to put yours.
I'm trying to publish mine. I'm also trying to get Tus and Matt to publish theirs simultaneously,
Yeah,
so
yeah,
that it would be basically like how we presented it. That
yeah,
because I set it up, we set it up as like a that we would build off of each other, and can't really do that if only one of us is releasing
yeah,
it.
yeah. Of course, yeah, yeah,
But it's up to them.
yeah,
Everybody has their own schedule.
yeah. Well, thanks a lot again, Cypher. Really appreciated it.
Glad
I'm
to
glad you
talk
took.
about this stuff. This is
Yeah,
really
it's
important.
no, it's fantastic. I knew you'd be somebody great to talk about on this because I know you're as passionate about this aspect of the issue as I am. And it's been an absolute delight and a great pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right.